Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm sorry we're not in Paris. I suspect everyone has said that today. We want to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done and what we are calling privacy sensitive robotics. Slide, please. We are in two different places, and so there'll be a little coordination as we move the slides. There we go. And so this is a, just go ahead and show everything on all the slides. There we go. So in some sense, this is a follow-on from Christoph's talk this morning. So we're going to touch on some of the same themes. But since it's the end of the day, we don't want to sort of preach at you. And we're kind of hoping to just raise a few things, maybe make you think about some things, ask some questions. For some of them, we don't really have any answers, but I think that is sort of the nature of privacy sensitive robotics at this point. And ultimately, what we're hoping is that you get excited about some of these questions and more people jump into this area. All right, slide. All right, so in this talk, we really want to hit on four things. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean, Matt and I mean by privacy. And so we've got a slightly different definition maybe than some other people have, or maybe a larger definition. We want to talk about some technical approaches that we've tried and we've seen that we can take to approaching privacy. So we're interested in not just talking about it, but actually achieving it on actual robots, implementing it in code and making sure it works. I'm going to talk a little bit about some privacy challenges currently, and maybe try and tie those to robotics a little bit. Mostly just to get you thinking about why robots are special in the context of privacy. And then finally, we're just going to talk about where we see privacy sensitive robots and privacy going over the next few years. So we're going to do, Matt's going to do some sections, I'm going to do some sections, and I believe the first section is Matt.
Sure. All right. Good morning from Los Angeles, everybody. And thank you, Bill. So I'm going to start out by talking about kind of the first thing, which is the definition of privacy. And yeah, a bigger definition of privacy, perhaps, than you may have heard before. So we did a literature review some years ago now of privacy literature. So this is not necessarily in robotics, just privacy literature writ large, and started to put together a taxonomy. So no one piece of literature had this entire taxonomy or exactly like this, but we tried to include all the different like constructs within the umbrella of privacy that were talked about by different scholars in the literature. And we kind of organized it into these four main categories and then some subfacets for each one. So most people, when you're talking about privacy, I think in the human-robot interaction space, are talking about informational privacy. So that includes invasion of your of a place where you can get access to someone's personal data, collecting their personal data, basically thinking about it and then sharing it with other people. The processing is like drawing inferences from those data. So I think that's maybe the most commonly used definition of privacy in these discussions. But look at all these other things. So physical privacy, you can also talk about someone's personal space, their territory. So that's like, if you come into my bedroom, that's like my space in a shared house, or if you are not renting like me, but own an entire house or are renting an entire house, your property. And then also modesty was part of that. And then psychological and social privacy. Psychological is kind of like physical privacy, but not necessarily. I think the best example of that I've heard is like if you're sitting at a bar across the room from someone and they're like staring at you. So they're not physically close to you, but you feel like they've come psychologically close to you. That's that idea of psychological distance there. And then interrogation is like not being able to resist attempts to kind of get access to your inner thoughts and feelings. And then social privacy has a bunch of things related to it. So if you look halfway down the list, solitude, like being able to be alone with yourself, with your thoughts and feelings, but several others. Crowding isolation, that's kind of related to physical privacy, arguably. Are there, is it hard to get away from other people? Or do you not have enough access to other people? Some scholars would call that part of privacy. The point of all this is to just highlight the breadth, just how big the concept of privacy is, that different scholars have used it to talk about a lot of different things. And I think it's important, if we're going to talk about it in human-robot interaction, to consider all these different facets, because they're all important, and not get too focused on just some parts of it. And they're all interconnected, right, in different ways. So there's a citation at the bottom. We have a paper just on arXiv that is basically just a bunch of pointers to really good privacy literature who talk about, the authors talk about these different things. This next section is also mine. I'm going to talk, like Bill said, about some technologies that could be used to protect privacy in the context of robotics. In particular, ways to constrain what a robot can perceive, where it can navigate to, and what sorts of manipulation actions it can take. So these are not fancy technologies. Neither were they necessarily designed for privacy protection, all of them at least. But this is just kind of highlighting how some technologies that we have already developed or have been thinking about, some ways that they could be used to protect privacy, like kind of on the front end. So like as the robot is moving around the world, potentially doing things and collecting data before the data come on board the robot, or before the robot actually enters your bedroom or whatever. What sorts of constraints could you put on the robot? So perception constraints, I'll give some examples of each of these. So starting at the top, pixelation and blurring, pretty simple stuff, right? This changes what sort of data make it on board the robot or to a remote operator. This one is more new. These are some collaborators. I believe they were at Cornell College in Iowa, in the US at the time. The idea here was that if you look at the top two images, the top left one is like an RGB camera, but turned to grayscale. But the top right one is a depth image. So the cool thing about depth images is that they, or depth cameras, is that they don't perceive texture. So you see the text on that book that says the big idea. That's not visible in the top right image, right? So we did, or they did some stuff here. We were kind of collaborating where if you do an edge filter on, I think it was an edge filter on the RGB image, but then kind of like filter through the depth image, you can remove that texture, but then still have like meaningful kind of geometry information so you can navigate, but without seeing the words. Kind of interesting, right? So the idea here is that you could maybe retain some types of information that you need to do your task, but then get rid of some of the other types of information that maybe people want to protect. Some other cool techniques from non-photorealistic rendering that shift the emphasis or abstract away certain parts of the scene. Redaction is more kind of brute force, just like cover up what you don't want somebody to see. And then the kind of gold standard, if you could do it, is replacement. So in the top image, you see those are laptops that have been replaced with the color of the chair behind them in the top right image. And then on the bottom, that's actually a young PhD student myself in the bottom left. But then we replaced me with what was behind me, what I was occluding, right? So of course, like if nobody even notices that the thing you're trying to protect or like exclude from the image was even there in the first place, then they won't even be suspicious. That's like the best you can get. Talk about navigation, so proxemics, how close the robot passes to people. There's been a lot of work in this area, looking at maybe designing the trajectories that a robot could take in terms of protecting your personal space. Oh, this is more visual privacy stuff. This is a real example of, this is a PR2 looking down at a table and some different kind of abstracting filters. Sorry, that was a bit out of order. This is back to the navigation stuff. On the bottom left, you can set up zones in that's just a two-dimensional map with a little turtlebot robot there. And you could set up some zones where the robot can't go. So, imagine that's, your living room after 6 p.m., that's when you're sitting and having a conversation with your family and you don't want to be interrupted or whatever. And so those could be zones that change with time, and maybe even that the robot could learn. And then on the right side are some ways to put constraints on manipulation. I think that's especially interesting for kind of private areas of somebody's body in the medical context, and having a robot know appropriate ways to touch someone, especially maybe to turn someone over in a hospital bed. Some interesting things to think about there. I think there could be some good technical solution approaches. Yeah, so, and this is a list of stuff that basically we did not see much of or did not find much of. Maybe we weren't looking hard enough for it. And I've highlighted a couple of them there. I know the third one down, automatic recognition of private regions. I want to note that Alan Wagner at Penn State has been looking at some of that, and I'm sure a couple other people as well. Like if you have a wearable camera, can you, for example, can that camera detect when you've switched kind of privacy context, so that the rules for filtering could be changed automatically? Very nice. Then if you look down at the bottom too, like getting away from, I think a lot of privacy thought has been on camera data and on informational privacy. But how can we start thinking more about psychological, social privacy and types of sensor data that are not visual, like laser distance data. Some people have talked about privacy for the maps that Roomba or other like home vacuum cleaner robots create, and how potential private information could be extracted from that. Lots of interesting things to think about there. And here's a hack at privacy protecting, or an interface for selecting what you want to be private. This was some work that I did in my PhD with Bill. And a couple different options, from just like a graphical click on the thing you want to protect interface to more physical interfaces, including something like on the far right side, just like leaving some sort of special tag. Maybe it would be like a QR code tag or a tag with a special symbol on it to tell an autonomous robot, like exclude this from the picture, from the imagery, as you maybe drive around my house cleaning up or something like that. Just some things to think about. And with that, I want to go back to Bill for starting to think about the future. That was kind of a lit review.
Unmute. Yeah, so to follow on from some stuff that Matt said there, I think one of the interesting pieces about implementing some of these privacy things were not just the implementation of them, but the recognition that robots have error in their sensors and their position. And so if you want to cover up, redact something in an image taken from the robot, there's going to be error in where that redaction takes place. And so it becomes a harder thing than saying just redact the box. You have to take it, take into account the fact that the robot will have error. It might think the box is in a different place. For the next section, I wanted to talk a little to the theme of the workshop about this avoiding dystopias. And next slide. So I wanted to be clear about what a dystopia was. So I Googled dystopia, an imagined state or society in which there is great suffering or injustice, typically one that is totalitarian or post-apocalyptic. And when I was invited to talk at the workshop, I thought this was a great idea. We could talk about avoiding these situations, and then 2020 happened, and I think, next slide, we're in a situation now where dystopias are not maybe as abstract as they might have been. The reason we're not all together today is because of COVID-19. There's been a lot of people around the world suffering because of this virus. Here in the US, if you've been following the news, there's a lot of unrest right now, a lot of protests going on across the country. And I think I want to talk a little bit about this and sort of link it back to the idea of using robots in contexts where they can either help or hurt these dystopias. And I want to just do it from a privacy perspective. I think there's meat in here. We could talk about this all day, but I just wanted to touch on this mostly as a framing device, because I think thinking about things that are happening to us now can really focus how we think about using robots in these situations. Next slide. So we have a pandemic, and there's a lot of technology that could help this pandemic. And we are technologists, we're roboticists, we're technologists, we understand larger contexts. I want to pick on contact tracing because contact tracing is really important, I think. So contact tracing, you get COVID-19, you become symptomatic. Contact tracing is the act of going out and figuring out who you've interacted with and then testing them. So you can start to figure out the possible transmissions of the virus. This really helps. So you can slow the spread of the virus really well by doing this, by figuring out who you've talked to, when you talk to them, and where you talk to them. But that's a real invasion of your privacy. And so I think we've got this situation where technology can really help. But for it to really help, you've got to give up your privacy. There's been a lot of talk about using apps on phones to do this, and I think that's fraught with peril. People have written volumes about that already. But it's opt-in. You choose to put the app on your phone, and you choose to give up your privacy. And I think that's a key distinction with a lot of the technologies that we have right now, is that they are active. You have to actively participate in these things. Next slide. Well, suppose we added robots to this. So you could have robots, and we've seen proposals for things like this in some parts of the world. Robots do face recognition and they track you. Now, face recognition is not a robot technology per se, but it could be implemented on robots. We could track people with drones. Even though we don't recognize them, we could have them followed with robotic technologies. The difference here is that we are taking this invasion of privacy and we're kind of hiding it a little bit. Okay? When I go out in public, I have less of an expectation of being of privacy. When I put an app on my phone, I have less of an expectation. But I'm doing that sort of willfully. Robots are this interesting technology where they can be where you don't expect them. They can follow you. They can take that agency away from you while they're doing the things that other technologies have traditionally done in the past. They also break these geographical restrictions. So if I go out there into my garden, I have an expectation of privacy. Drones and other robot technologies can break that by overflying. I'm no longer sure of where I can be observed, of where my privacy is being potentially being infringed. So again, you're giving up that control, giving up that willful joining of that system. And by doing that, we really risk, I think one of the key things of informational privacy is a notification that there is a risk and giving you the chance to opt out of it. So right now, the only chance, if there was pervasive robot monitoring of me, the only way I could opt out of that would be to stay at home. Maybe, and then turn off Amazon Echo and all my devices and probably turn off Zoom, right? And so it becomes that more pervasive and that more difficult to live your life if you do want to draw those privacy boundaries around yourself. Next slide. So there's a lot of unrest in the US right now, a lot of rioting, a lot of demonstrations. And so the right to protest, as you're seeing in the US, is protected under many countries' laws, under European law, and under international law. In the US, it's protected primarily by the First Amendment. You're allowed to go out and you're allowed to protest peacefully. But people who are protesting may want to obscure their identities. They may want to do it for good purposes. They don't want retribution. They don't want to lose their job if their employer doesn't agree with the protest. They may want to do it for bad purposes. They may be looting. They may be instigating violence. A lot of people wear face masks at these gatherings, especially now in the pandemic era. Just as a sidebar, it's sort of an interesting thing with the US law is that covering your face with a face mask is not protected under the First Amendment. and is actually illegal in some states currently. So the government here is telling you to do an illegal thing when you go out there. It's incredibly complicated and messy. And I think the thing to take from that is not US First Amendment law, but it's complicated. There isn't an actual answer for some of this. And that's a pervasive thing with privacy technologies. Next slide. Again, you could bring technology to this. You could use face detection technologies, robots, drones, overflights, even ground robots to find troublemakers in crowds, identify them, and pick them out. And I think that would be a good thing, seeing the things we've seen in the US this week. But that's a bad thing at the same time, simultaneously, because you want people at a demonstration to have the right to privacy if they want it, so they can exercise their rights. And again, it's a complicated question. The same things that I talked about with COVID-19 and contact tracking apply here. Now, it's not just at the demonstration where you could potentially be tracked. A drone could fly with you back to your house. So there's a deeper privacy invasion that could be there. If you're wearing a mask and you walk away, the drone could follow you. You don't have that geographic box anymore. Follow you, wait till you take your mask off. Again, it's both good and bad. I think there are useful, legitimate uses of these technologies, and there are dystopian uses of these technologies. It increases, the use of these technologies, robotics, face recognition, increases the ability of law enforcement to get around privacy expectations. They can do things that you might not think they could do, and you don't get the opt-out. In the US, there are problems with the Fourth Amendment, which is the search and seizure amendment. I'm not allowed to look at your stuff unless I have a due cause. You can get around that, and that makes it really complicated from a legal point of view. Next slide. So what's the risk? Those are two very specific examples, but I think if we think about this year, if we think about this month, this week, there are lots of ways we could see these privacy invading technologies like robotics helping, and they would be a good thing. They could slow a virus. They could pick out the looters in a crowd of peaceful protesters. Those are both good things. We want both of those, but they come with risk. They give they unleash a technology that can be used for other things. And I think this is a very, this is a very generic statement. Technology is neither good nor bad, but once it's out, it's out. And I think now the barriers to deploying these technologies are lower than they were last week or the week before or the month before or last year, because there are these pressing needs. And one of the things I encourage people to do is to think about those barriers and how people can argue for these technologies to be deployed in times of need. Next slide. No answers. I'm going to skip over this quickly so that Matt has some time. I think the important part of this is that it's on us to think about this now. Just like we've been talking about militarized robots for years now, we need to be talking about privacy and robots, because there is a real need. This isn't science fiction anymore. We're seeing systems that are being deployed in the world that actually are running the risk of violating privacies in a significant way. We need to think about that. Not just robots, but robots make it worse, because robots can move around, they can open doors, they can be where you don't expect them to be. Next slide. It's not just a technical solution. I love technical solutions because I'm a computer scientist by training. We'll build some interfaces and they'll be clever, but some of the solutions are legislative. The GDPR is a privacy protecting solution, depending on who you talk to. Some of the solutions will be societal. We should talk to lawmakers about this and make sure they understand the technologies and the ramifications of the technologies. Next slide. We can't do it alone. I'm delighted to see this workshop because there's such a difference of background in this workshop. That's glorious to see. We need to do that. It's not just computer scientists or roboticists or ethicists or legal scholars. We all have to do it together. And we need to think about how our system interacts with the world, how it changes the assumptions that people make about privacy, whether that's location or how autonomous the system is, what it can do, how long it can do it for, and what can we do to mitigate this without compromising what we want the robot to do. Next slide. All right, with that, I'll leave Matt to wrap up, and I'll shut up.
Yeah, I just want to kind of leave everybody with some additional thoughts for future directions here, kind of as what Bill was just talking about is kind of ringing in your head. We had a workshop. It was the first workshop at HRI to be specifically about privacy a couple of years ago in Vienna, and we brought together, I don't know, maybe 12, 13, 14 people from a lot of different disciplines, including a couple folks from law and policy to talk about these sorts of topics. But one thing that came out of that was a survey, and it was kind of a brainstorm of what directions to go in next for privacy-sensitive robotics research, for privacy and human-robot interaction research. So I just kind of wanted to leave you with that, maybe as a way to frame some of the thoughts specific to protest demonstrations and COVID-19 that Bill was talking about. These are directions that we were thinking privacy research needs to head in, some of which we kind of already are, like number one, but it could be expanded a lot within robotics. But some of these are not talked about quite so much. So think about number 6, which is like thinking about particular domains as kind of special domains, like what's unique about the home, what's unique about the medical domain, what's unique about the public square, for example, where people are going out and demonstrating at this particular time. And then number 3, trust, something we haven't talked about much today, but some privacy scholars have talked about how we should get away from just talking about whether people are violated or having their privacy violated, and talk more about how we can build trust between people and between people and law enforcement, between people and robotics companies, particular robot manufacturers. It's a relational thing. How can we get to where we trust, and rightfully so, the people who are creating and operating these different robotic technologies? So I wanted to leave this up there as kind of a crib sheet while people are asking some questions. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk a little bit this morning in Los Angeles, sorry. And of course, great to be alongside Bill, thinking about some of these issues together. So we'd love to hear any thoughts or questions from anybody. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill and Matt, for the wonderful talk. It was very thought-provoking. We don't have that much time for questions, and we have so many questions. So I will go through them, and it would be nice if you answer them shortly, if it's possible. So the first question is from Hildegard, and she asked, she said it's a naive question. Would an institution like, let's say, FBI, be able to access the unfiltered information?
That is a great question. There are no naive questions in this. I think that's really complicated. You know, we see the FBI interacting with Apple, but maybe we could build a camera which in its hardware never stores the actual image, but performs those transformations in hardware, and that's the only thing that comes out. So maybe we can design it in such that there is no unfiltered image.
So the next question is from Emily. She asked, is it positive to see how influential technology has been in allowing us to maintain a sense of normal working life, at least irrespective of the lockdown measures?
Matt?
Yeah, the only quick thought I have about that is kind of what you were saying about the genie being out of the bottle. That I think, yeah, that technology has had a big positive impact during this time. But with respect to privacy, we should have our eyes open and be thinking about how these technologies could be allowed to progress a lot during this time because of the special circumstance without being thought about too carefully. So we just have to be thinking carefully about them. And maybe technology could be good for helping to protect privacy as well. I don't want to just be negative.
Yeah, and I think the second part of that question, is it truly opt-in when you have to use the technologies we're using right now for work? No, it's not, because I think this is maybe an example, right? We have the pandemic. Everyone uses Zoom. Everyone uses teleconferences because that's what we do, because that's what we have to do. That's the pressure. That's the lowered barrier to adoption. And now there's a privacy violation. You can see that I don't clean my office at home. My office is a bedroom. There are these lowered barriers, and now we're not opt-in anymore because if I want to participate in this workshop, this is the only way I can do it.